building a TV series tracker in Notion the right way. Maybe you're a TV buff like me and you're just longing to look back on those fantastic series that has ended. Mad Men, Suits and Family Guy, or you're just planning and waiting for the next episode of Simpsons to come up, or waiting simply for the Lazarus Project to start so you can start watching that. Either way, I think the TV series tracker is something that will feel right at home in your Notion system. Welcome to day 40 of Notion Expert's 100 Days of Notion video series. Today we're looking into creating a TV series tracker in Notion using multiple databases that connect. So we're going to create one database for the series, one for the seasons, and one for the episodes. And we're going to connect these together to make a nice little dashboard where we track our data. Reaching that state, we will use Rollups to aggregate the data. We will also see that there are some limitations in Notion when you use multiple databases, which may or may not mean you want to use this exact approach. Let's create that page to get started. So, why do I even call it the right way? Well, to me, designing a database structure, you want to separate different things. So we have a few different things going on, as we alluded to. We have the actual series, the name of the series, we have the season, and we have the episodes. So in this version of this TV series tracker, we're going to separate these three entities into different databases, and we'll look at the pros and cons of that. We'll later revisit this and join these in one database where we will simply add all properties into one big table. But for now, we're doing three different databases, so we'll create those to get going. We'll create inline databases to see what we're doing. So we'll add a few series. We'll start by adding Mad Men. We'll add The Simpsons. And lastly, the Lazarus Project. So we'll start by adding two date properties here. And since Notion supports both adding start and end date in the same property, we're going to use that. So let's add just one date property, and we call it air time. For Mad Men, it started in July 19, 2007. We'll include an end date since it has ended, and that was May 17, 2015. Going to The Simpsons, they actually started back in 1989, can you believe it? And they haven't ended yet, so they are still going strong. We won't include an end date for this one. Lastly, we have the Lazarus Project, which premiered in 2022, June 16, and it's still going on. If we then move over to the seasons, so we of course want to say here season 1, season 2 and so on, but the most important thing missing here is the relation, the link to the series database. So we want to link to the series database. It can only be linked to one TV series. We want to show the link back, and we want to call it seasons. Let's add that relationship. If we start with Mad Men, it actually ran for 7 seasons, so let's add those. Then we go ahead and we link the right series here. So it's Mad Men here. Let's see if we can copy this. That went well. And as we fill these links, we can also see that the seasons are linked back on the series. We won't do The Simpsons for now, simply due to that taking a huge amount of time. But if we skip ahead to the Lazarus Project, we can see that there is one season that has passed and one season planned. Right, so let's add season 1 and season 2. Great. let's link the Lazarus project for this one and for this one as well. The next thing to consider is what kind of information we want to track here. But I'm thinking we're going to use the Rollup properties here to track these things, so let's try that out with the Lazarus project and add some episodes. Going down to the episode, we're just going to call it episode 1. We of course do have more formal names, but let's be a little bit quick about this. For this one, we want to link back to the season. So a relationship column and linking to the season DB. We want to limit to just one season that each episode is connected to. We want to show it back and we want to call it episodes. Great. And now we're starting to see a little bit of an issue here. The problem is that if we just call them season without any extra information, it's kind of hard to link them. Now when we're starting out, you can say that, okay, I add the episodes all the way back here since we're looking at season 1. I mean, we can just simply add all these episodes and be happy, but you can kind of see that this will break down if you have much more data here. You could get around this by calling each episode something more recognizable. So let's call it Lazarus and the classic season 01, episode 02. So we have a kind of unique identifier in the name. We would do the same here. So we would call this Lazarus season 1. And all of a sudden now you see that all of these are much easier to find. We can see the season we're looking for. So this would probably be my recommended approach here, but I just wanted to show you what happens if we do it the kind of natural way. We have these connected up, and for some reason we have the created time. I'll just remove this. Instead we want to add the air time or air date. Air date, great. So for these ones they started in June 16th. So June 16, 2022, and then we do a little trick. So we add these since they kind of aired consecutively, so it's easier to do that. 23, 30, 7. All right. So we have the 8 episodes, 1 per week. And now we can go up here and we see all the episodes. We know that underlying they have dates. So let's try to pick those up. So we create a rollup for that. And we look at a relationship. We look at episodes, and the property we're looking at would be air date. First we have here show original, and that's great. So now we see all the episode dates and they kind of correspond to each other. Then we can have a few different calculations. So we can have count all, count unique, count empty, percent, earliest, latest, date range. So let's choose the date range here and see what happens. So it said that it went on for 2 months, which is great, but doesn't tell us much. So let's go back in and we choose the earliest date. So now we have the earliest date. We call that first air date. We create a new rollup. Select episodes, air date, and now we choose latest date. And we call this last air date. Okay? And these happen to be relative. I mean, I would optimally have wanted a date here. So if we try to go in to fix this, we realize that you actually can't. So there are no real options here, and you just get a few months ago if it's a recent date, which to me is very strange. it doesn't really matter that much. You can still pick this up. So if we create a formula here, we can call it air dates, and then we can go to edit formula. We now have our first and last air date properties. So we have the first air date property. So if we just pick this up, we can see that all of a sudden we actually get a date. And why is that? Well, if we go into the formula, we see that we pick up the first air date, and we also see by the calendar icon here that Notion knows it is a date behind the scenes, but it just chooses to visualize it in a relative manner here. So this is very interesting, but since it is a formula, we can actually format this as we want. So if we create a little space here and we go down to our operators, we can look for our date functions, timestamp, from timestamp, date add, subtract, date between. All right, so this returns the time between the two dates. This was what we had before, where we saw that it aired for a couple of months. And then we have the interesting one that we're looking for. So we have the format date. I'm going to use an ISO standard date format here. You can use whatever date format you want. Sorry, I actually added these in the wrong order. So we have the property first, and then we have the formatting, and we press done. And now we have a very concise version of this. But as we called it air dates, we want to add the second date as well. So we just take the second property here and we call it last air date, and now we have a nice date range. As you can see now, the concatenation we did, the first air date and the last air date, whenever we don't pick up anything, we simply get the space dash space formatting here. We could fix that, but to me it's not a big deal. It looks fine. Now we're tracking this episode. If we go back to the series, maybe we would like some similar type of information. We can see that for Mad Men here, we're already getting this since we specified a date range. Maybe that's good enough, but just know that we could pick up these dates from the different episodes. So if we kind of assume that the second season of the Lazarus project actually happens, we can look what this looks like. So we call this Lazarus Season 2, just so we know what we're doing. The little problem here with Lazarus specifically, maybe making this quite a bad example, is that while Season 2 has been confirmed, there aren't any dates yet. No matter, let's simply copy this and assume it airs the exact same date, but in 2023 instead. It's probably wrong, but it doesn't really matter for our purposes here. So we call this Lazarus Season 2 episode. I'll copy that so I have it easily accessible. And now we can do a little trick here. So if we don't want to set all of these things every time, we can use the little filter trick. So we said this would air June 16, 2023. So June 16, 2023. Great. And now we create a filter that filters advanced filter, so we can add multiple things, where season contains Lazarus Season 2 and date is within exact dates. So we select a range from January 1st to January 1st, 2024. Okay, good. So now we see the first episode here, and when we start putting in new ones, you can see it forces, using this forcing filter, the season to be Lazarus Season 2, and we get a best guess of the date. We continue with this. It happened to be only 6 episodes, but it is what it is. So now we see here that the relative dates, they change. So this happens in 5 months and it ends in 6 months. And we have a date range where this is picked up. So we can do a similar thing for the series database. If we go up here, we create a rollup, and then we select the relation seasons. We will see something a little bit funny here. So if we select the property, and we of course expect to see our rollup date property, the min date and the max date that we created down there, we can say they are not here. So we can select the name, that works. We can select the air dates, which is the closest to what we want. We can look at calculation, but we no longer see the min date and the max dates. So let's look at this. What happened here? So it simply picked all the values. So season 1, these are the air dates for season 1. Season 2, these are the air dates for season 2. I mean, this is kind of great, but it's not really what we want. We would have wanted to pick up the first and last air dates and aggregate those, but those aren't options. So how do we do that? As we saw before, we can create a formula column. We call it first air date 2. We edit the formula and we simply pick first air date property. As we saw when we did that the last time, we got a real date, and it's no longer a rollup type, it's a kind of sum type. So if we do the rollup thing again, we will now be able to pick the seasons relation. We can pick the property, the first air date 2, and now all of a sudden we have the earliest date option. We see we're back to this 7 months ago, but at least we notice that it's the earliest of these two. We can do the same for last air date. So we create the last air date, simply click done, we call it last air date 2. We can call this first air date. So we create a new property here. We select a rollup. We call it last air date. We use the seasons relation. We pick the last air date 2 property, and we take the latest date in this. All right, so now we see that Lazarus, if we scroll back a little bit here, it's very, very long. Let's hide the tags. Lazarus, 2 seasons, they ran for these dates, and we see that the first air date of this is 7 months ago, and the last air date that we know of is in 6 months. So that's great. We have aggregated all the data, which is very nice, and we can see everything we want. A nice thing we would like to do here is, of course, to create a timeline view. And if you followed along in the last episode, we looked into timeline views as the kind of bonus when we looked at dependent tasks, subtasks, and parent tasks. So we're going to do a similar thing here. So we'll create a new view. We'll select the timeline view, and now we're starting to look at the little limitation of Notion. So we need to select a specific data source. So we can only select either series or episode or season DB. We can't select multiple. So we'll select the series DB for now, new empty view. It's a timeline view. We remove the database title, and we're starting to see the timeline here. And if we zoom out now, let's see, month. Maybe we simply select a year here so we can see the entire thing. We scroll up a little bit, and nothing. So why is that? So if we look under database title here, we can see that it says show timeline by airtime. All right, so let's go down to our source of truth here to look at what it looks like. So we expected to see the Lazarus project here, and we have the airtime, and we can see that we don't really have a duration. We only set a single date here since it hasn't ended yet. To overcome this, to show here, we need to set an end date. So let's include the end date here, and we set that to July 16. Okay. So now, all of a sudden, we will see the Lazarus project. We can see all the way back and all the way forward, so it's looking as we expect it to look. But maybe we prefer to signify it hasn't ended yet, so we remove the end time, we back out, and now if we go up again, we see that this nice long time indicator has been removed and it has been replaced with this little dot. We can see the same for The Simpsons, also a little dot. That's also just one date. And if we go to Mad Men and look, that looks like a nice little time range indicator, since we have both a start airtime and an end airtime. So how do we fix it? Well, if we look in the table here, we see that apart from the airtime property, we now have aggregated through the use of Rollups the first air date and last air date. And luckily, if we go to the timeline, we go to layout, we look at show timeline by, and instead we select first air date, we see that there is a little property here, separate start and end dates. So we click that, and as the end date we select last air date. We close this again. Now let's see where we're at. If we look here, we can see the Lazarus project has been added here. That is the one with air dates, first air date and last air date. The other two aren't shown at all. A thing we can do to show them is to go back and we add the table data again. We can remove the database title now, so we clean it up a little bit. We close this again, and now we see that we have Simpsons, Mad Men, and Lazarus project, and the only one with an actual date range is the Lazarus project. Normally, in the timeline, you can do something like this. You can add a date. This won't work here, and why is that? Well, it's simply because these are computed properties, rollups, and not something that can be set directly. So to set these, we would need to go down. We would need to add episodes down here. Those would aggregate up to the seasons, which in turn would aggregate up to the series and fill this with data. But in general, I think we solved exactly what we set out to do with the series database, the database design way, not necessarily the Notion way. So we have our episodes. We calculate the first and last episode for each season. We then aggregate that data up to the series, where we save the first air date and the last air date, and then we visualize that on a timeline. If we look back on the last episode where we looked at the timeline with dependent properties, parent-child relationships and so on, what we would really like to do here is to be able to expand the Lazarus project and see the different seasons on the timeline. But here is the limitation of Notion that I talked about in the beginning. So here we run into the limitation that the timeline as a visualization can only visualize one database, and here we chose the series database. That means that despite us actually having the relation, so we do know the two seasons here, we can't visualize them on the same timeline, unfortunately. So we'll end things here, and we'll pick this up in the next episode, where we will look into transforming the structure to be more Notion friendly. As a little sneak peek preview of that, what will happen is that we will put both the series, the seasons, and the episodes in the same database, and that will mean that we can visualize them on the same timeline. I hope you enjoyed this one, and make sure you hit that subscribe and notify bell icon so you don't miss the follow-up to this. Thank you very much for joining, and hope to see you next time. Have a nice day!